Well, welcome. This is our recall rundown with Jim Ross. Uh, as many of you know, San Francisco is facing the prospect of at least three different recalls. One statewide for governor, another for our three members of the school board that are eligible to be recalled. There was a lot of discussion about recalling the entire school board. But only three of them are eligible because the other four were just elected. Let me just make sure everyone's muted real quick. The Chesa Boudin, the district attorney, is facing two different recall attempts. So that sort of is something that's going on in the background as well. And as of right now, it looks like the governor's race is the only one that has all of or potentially has all of the signatures. And so we wanted to have one of our local political experts, Jim Ross, come in to talk about it. So Jim, you've been working in politics for how many years now? Jim, you're on mute.
Professionally, I've been involved in politics for 30 years.
So professionally for 30 years and a longtime San Francisco political consultant. I want to say most recently you've worked with Jane Kim and on Baby C, right? The Baby Prop C.
Yep, the kids Prop C, and then we did the progressive slate for the DCCC last year.
Oh, and the progressive, which swept almost entirely. And then going back, you actually ran then Supervisor Newsom's successful mayoral campaign back in 2003, right?
I did, and I apologize for that.
We won't hold it against you. So obviously a longtime political hand, somebody who can speak with expertise to all of this. And so I figured it would be great for us to have Jim come and chat about that. So Jim, I'll throw it to you. Why don't you start us off?
Thanks, and it's great to be here. And I wanted to start because it's not a good conversation about politics unless there's a caveat at the beginning. And my caveat at the beginning is I don't have anything personally or professionally in these recalls, right? So I don't have a candidate in the race. I don't have any real personal opinion on the validity of the recall. This is just, and I'm going to keep it mostly just to kind of the politics of it, or not the politics, just the logistics of it, because that's a lot of what drives these things, less than the politics. But we can get into that as well. I'm not going to be solely on that, but I think a lot of the beginning of it kind of really frames around that. And it's always nice talking about San Francisco politics because San Francisco always leads the way. Not only are there two separate recalls in 2 recalls, 5 committees in San Francisco, because we'll get into that, because you can never just have it's simple and straightforward in San Francisco. But 2 recalls, 5 committees in San Francisco, but there's also recalls going on throughout the state on the local level, which is really kind of an interesting dynamic. The district attorney up in Sonoma is being recalled. There's an LA City Council member that's being recalled. There's a couple members of the city council in a small town in LA County being recalled. Basically there's a whole bunch of recalls going on up and down the state. What's driving that is I think something we should try to talk about or try to suss out, because there's a lot of people on this call who probably have thoughts about that as well. What's driving kind of this recall palooza that we have in the state of California now. But as always, San Francisco is leading the way for the rest of the state, both with the district attorney and the school board recall measures. Just one thing it helps, and I know there's folks here who probably have researched it or looked into the rules around recall. And so it's helpful just to know what it takes to recall somebody. And, it's not easy. It's not straightforward. And there's a high bar to get there. A citywide candidate, you need 10% of the voters in San Francisco at the time you submit your papers. So current registered voters is in San Francisco is 500,800. It may have been a few fewer, when the recalls were actually submitted. But the first barrier that all these recalls face is how do you come up with somewhere around, well, if you need 50,000 valid signatures, you really probably need like 80,000 total signatures, 85,000 total signatures. Usually figure at least 30% more total to qualify. So, how do you come up with 85,000 signatures? And that's where you get into this dynamic where recalls become really a function of time and money. There's probably enough signatures in San Francisco at this moment in time or enough people that are willing to sign a petition at this moment in time to recall the DA and recall the school board. Might be tight, but there's probably enough. What the problem is how do you get in front of them? Just the physical act of signature gathering and that's just that's a mechanical piece, but it's really a piece of money. Paid signatures right now in California are going anywhere between $6 and $9 a signature, depending on what you're trying to gather for. So you're looking at a 50,000 signature, 185,000 total signatures, 50,000 valid signature campaign. You're going to end up needing to qualify the measure somewhere between $350,000 and $500,000, right? And that's why you look at like the Boudin recall measures, and they have raised like 30, or 35,000, right? They're just not raising the money at a clip, but that can change really quickly, and we've seen that happen. And it just takes one check or one person to kind of to write that check or to move forward with that. So you have that piece, and then of course it's never a San Francisco petition drive until you start having some fights in the street. And even though the school board recall hasn't kind of raised enough money, or what you would consider enough money for this, you can tell that there's people on the street for it, and there's real people out there gathering. So that's always another question of how can you drive a volunteer turnout. The main issue with getting signatures for a recall petition with volunteers is just the time. You have 160 days to get this done, and now to a little bit of history, like the Ed Lee recall in 2016, it just ran out of time. I mean, there were actually people out getting signatures. They had raised a bit of money, and that race really they ran out of time there. And even the Newsom recall statewide would not have qualified, but a judge gave them additional time to gather signatures because of the COVID pandemic. But if it wasn't for that ruling, and it wasn't for that for that kind of that extra time that they got, they wouldn't have qualified. And it's pretty typical that elected officials in San Francisco get recalled. I think Jake McGoldrick was basically, there was maybe a half a dozen I don't exaggerating. There's probably 3 recalls that I can remember, at least 2 that I know of pretty well can remember, attempts to recall Jake. I think Chris Daly had 2 or 3 pop up against him. So it's been pretty common that San Francisco elected officials get recalled or get, have the signature gathering piece happen. It's the second piece where that actually qualifies and gets qualified and ends up before the voters that is much rarer. And the one time that people really talk about and is really kind of the legendary recall is the recall of Dianne Feinstein, in 1983, which is even before my time. I've been around San Francisco politics for a long time, but it's before my time. But I've talked to a lot of people about it. I went and did a little bit of research on it. Dianne Feinstein beat back the recall. At that time, there were 772 precincts in the city of San Francisco. She won every single precinct except for one. She got 82% of the vote. And it really actually made her stronger. She was up for election the next year. And, it made her stronger going into the next year. And she didn't have a real opponent in that race when she ran the next time, and, kind of really set up the rest of her time as mayor. And it's an interesting point when you think about recalls. One of the things that happens is recalls that fail make the politician that was attempted to be recalled stronger. And there's a variety of reasons why. So back up. So if you're an opponent of somebody, it's a very risky strategy, because if you fail, if you go at the king and miss, they are stronger than before. And the reason why, the variety of reasons before. One is they get to go build a coalition, not on their record, but on the validity of the recall. And most politicians don't like recalls, and they'll just say, well, I don't support their policies, but I oppose the recall. Well, at that point in voters' minds, it's like, well, if you don't oppose a recall, then you're supporting them, and it helps them grow that breadth of coalition. So that's kind of issue one. Issue two is it gives them an opportunity to build an organization in an off year, right? Raise money, get volunteers, do all of these things in a time when they normally wouldn't be able to. So it really is as somebody who, if you want to take out a politician, a recall is a real risky strategy, because you get one shot at it. If you do it and they beat it back, they become much stronger and have a much better chance of winning re-election or staying in office. So, I think there's a real issue there. You look at, most of these recalls, they fail before they get to the ballot, right? They don't get the signatures, they run out of time, they don't raise enough money, and they just don't really build that support to get them over the edge. And looking in San Francisco, though, you have, the history of incumbents losing in San Francisco usually takes, a combination of two factors. One is the politician has to be corrupt or provably corrupt, provably, that's a key word, or incompetent, or a combination of both, right? And voters will usually put up with a little bit of incompetence if they're not corrupt. We had a mayor that kind of fit that model. Or they'll put up with a little bit of incompetence, if they're likable and kind of push through. And we've had a variety of politicians like that. So, really the question when you look at these candidates running, in the recall that they're facing, where do they reach that incompetence and corruption threshold for a recall? And, I think that's something that we can debate and discuss. But the key is, how do voters perceive that? You're all very active in politics and probably have real opinions on that. Do voters see them raising to that threshold of competence or corruption? I've been talking for 10 minutes, and I'm Irish, but I can talk for a while, but I feel like I should probably shut up for a minute and let people ask questions. And there's others on this call that I see names pop up and have real history with recalls and what's gone on in San Francisco. So, I'd also like to hear if other people have thoughts.
Well, before we get to that, a few things. So you gave your caveat at the beginning. I want to give a caveat as well, which is for anybody on this call, the District 2 Democratic Club has not taken a stand on any of the recalls. We don't plan to until they officially qualify for the ballot. So just want to make that clear right off the bat. And I know we also have Gloria Berry here from the DCCC. And the DCCC actually, which is, for those of you that don't know, the overarching county Democratic committee for the city of San Francisco, city and county of San Francisco, actually recently passed a resolution, I believe, that was authored by Ms. Berry, that is condemned all of the recalls, the recall of Governor Newsom, the attempted recalls of the school board, and the recall of the attempted recall of the district attorney. So Gloria, I'll give you a moment. Do you just want to say your piece on that before we move on?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm thankful for Janice Lee to bring attention to me this meeting tonight. And I also am thankful to even, this different districts, I think should collaborate more and speak with each other more. I'm from District 10, born and raised in District 5. So thank you for having me. I drafted the resolution because I understand frustrations in elected officials. I don't ever remember in my life being 100% happy with anybody who's been in office. I went to the public schools, through the public school system in the 70s. My mom pulled me out because of the problems that existed then, that still exist now. The governor, I've always felt at the state level, never put enough money into education, into the budget. That's always bothered me. And I never supported a district attorney in my life until Mr. Boudin came on board. And I believe across the board that there is going to be things that each of these three positions that we are talking about, where their frustrations may lie. And I definitely believe the pandemic put us at a level of frustration that's even higher than normal, and where we are much more aware of what politicians say, do, and whatnot, because we were all at home almost a year watching more closely than we normally do. So I say that to say that I'm not 100% pleased with any of those positions, but I definitely believe in the voters voted for who they voted for. And we could go into what my plus and minuses are for each position, and also my empathy towards people who are frustrated with each level of office that was on the resolution. But that was my initial reason why I think the people who were elected by the people should be able to fulfill their term, unless, like the speaker before me said, it's something totally, clearly, blatantly corrupt, criminal, or so incompetent that it's just the whole position is just in turmoil, and it's almost like I can't even think of an example right now. I listed in when I did my introduction, the senators that were in the bathroom at the airport doing things, and people snorting cocaine, and different things like that. And excuse me if I talk raw sometimes, because that's how I am. But unless it's something that's just so outrageous, I feel that we do our best by pushing politicians to do what more we want. I've been going to hearings and doing public comment to this day. I've been doing it for over 10 years, and I've seen results when the community stands in those lines and tells officials what we want. So I could talk a while as well, but I'm definitely open to questions. If we want to get more specific on each office and position, I can, but I definitely want to respect that this is D2's club and that members should have the floor.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, Ms. Berry, thank you for coming. Thank you for letting us know about what your thought process was behind drafting this resolution. And Jim, I think this actually brings up a really good point, which is that there are a lot of different reasons behind why someone would be interested in launching a recall to begin with, and what the bar is for why they're even or for why you should recall a public official. So is there anything written out as to what reaches the level of recall, or is that just up to the minds of the voters? And a second point is, so what is it? Because you mentioned that there's something that's sort of that's underlying, that's driving all of these recalls. What is it that you see that's driving these recalls up and down the state?
In California, there's no standard for recall of a politician. So you can recall them because they don't like their haircut, or whatever the reason is. There's no standard for that. And I think actually there's been some proposed recalls for candidates because of their haircut. But not to be too flippant, but no, there's no reason, right? And for that. But I think Ms. Barry Gloria touched on something that has happened. Well, there's some that are interesting. So like the Sonoma DA's race, which I'm not engaged in, but we're doing a little project in Sonoma, so I've gotten about it. It's fascinating. The DA charged a developer with a crime, for a project they were doing up there, and the developer funded a recall against the developer. So it's kind of a remarkable kind of a remarkable use of the power, right? That or abuse of the power, right? But and he was able to fund it, right? You got to kind of that's kind of one of them. But also you have a variety of situations where people are actually corrupt or incompetent. I mean, the mayor of Windsor up in Sonoma also comes to mind, who was clearly a serial rapist who should have been recalled and ended up resigning and getting out. And that happens a bit too in these recall situations, where you'll get somebody who gets recalled or comes up to that standard, and as the recall happens, they'll just give up and they'll resign. And that, I think that's one of the other ideas to force it. But I also think we spent a year, maybe 2020 is perhaps the most highly political year that I've encountered in my lifetime, right? I think people focused and paid attention to politics at a level, much higher than I've ever encountered. People had time to doom scroll at 2 a.m. to figure it all out. You got a president who was inflaming this. And what happens with politics is when people start thinking about politics, they don't just start thinking about the president or the governor. They think about politics broadly, and all politics kind of starts to bubble up. So it created, I think, a much more political and politicized environment that we were dealing with. So I think a lot of the recalls we're seeing in San Francisco in 2021 are a lot of ways a hangover from 2020. I also think a little bit of just the anxiety that COVID has created on top of all of that, right? People keep their jobs, they can be able to live in their homes, just the condition of life in San Francisco, I think is really wearing on people. So all of that kind of, churns into a ball that creates this frustration. But also it's hard to tell, actually it's not hard to tell. You look at this point, who's given money to these campaigns, kind of how many people are around it. They're all in San Francisco, at least, they're all pretty small. There's a lot of people have been around campaigns here, and right now none of these would even be an impressive district supervisor race at this stage in terms of what the size of these campaigns. By size, I mean it's like how many people are volunteering, how many people are giving money, all of those things. They just really haven't built that base of real action or activity. And in politics, all politics, kind of there's 3 factors: time, people, and money. And none of these campaigns for the recall to recall anybody at this point really have an extraordinary amount of time money or people. And then their time is limited by just the nature of the law for the recall, right? So they have 160 days, and neither of them really have the time or the money. Recalls are the kind of thing where you really want to have, to quote Napoleon, but you want to bring up the ammunition before you bring up the artillery, right? You want to bring out the money before you launch the campaign, before you start trying to fire shots. And that none of these campaigns did that, kind of got to that point. They just, I think the first Boudin recall really struck me as kind of a Republican Hail Mary to try to establish some relevance in San Francisco, right? Kind of they're going to throw deep and maybe they get lucky. That's why there's this big fight. We haven't talked about that. That's the fun thing. There's this big fight between the competing DA campaigns. You got.
Oh, I'm saving that for later. I want to. You can't have
I
dessert
didn't
first.
know. I don't want to step on your agenda.
No. I don't want us to have dessert first. We got to get to that after the meal. But I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to talking about that one because I think that's particularly interesting. But let's talk a little bit more about the mechanics. So, first, what's going on with the governor's recall, and how is a gubernatorial recall different than a local recall? Because I think they do have different. They're run slightly differently.
Yeah. So, I think the first thing off the top is the signature threshold's much higher. But it's also broken down through a variety of counties have to make the call, the counts, all of that sort of thing. And then once it gets enough signatures, once it's certified as that, there's so the state legislature, when Josh Newman, who actually was very involved in San Francisco politics at one point, state senator from Southern California, when he was recalled, the legislature put in a variety of rules that slowed down the process for certifying a recall election. So the first of those is there's a 30-day period, which we're coming close to the end on now, or we have come to the end, almost to the end on. So that's what I was talking about. It's just fascinating. But anyway, it 30 days for anybody to remove their name from the petition, right? So there was a 30-day period after the signatures were certified that people could remove their name, and then there was a 30-day period of time for the legislature to determine the cost of the election, and then the lieutenant governor sets the date for, which is a little bit different. The Secretary of State doesn't do it. The lieutenant governor sets the date for the election. So there's a variety of factors that kind of start to weave into a gubernatorial one in terms of where it gets timing and those sorts of things. And then, of course, the signatures, the threshold is much higher. Every governor in California history since Edmund Brown, Jerry Brown's dad, has had a recall filed against them. And the only reason why I know that is that's as far back as I bothered to look. And actually, I also think that, so the recall was a tool. I mean, it's an interesting, not to get into the history too much, because and it's actually came out of the progressive, small p progressive era. The same reason why California has the ability to put, a citizen's ability to put ballot measures, do ballot initiatives and put measures before voters, that really kind of came out of that small p progressive era. And one of the ideas, or one of the hopes, would be it would actually help blunt the power of the railroads at the time. So it's actually an interesting, came out of a kind of a progressive idea. And then, conservatives and Republicans have kind of latched onto it. But yeah, the governor's recall, is still kind of going through that process. A date's not been set. looking like the governor and his folks will go earlier in that process, try to push that process earlier. It seems like that's where the consensus is going. And I think the earliest they could go is, I believe, September, middle of September, and then or they could push it a bit later. So it just depends on the dating, on the timing on that.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So it was Josh Newman's recall that led to the legislature making these changes, because for those of us that have been around long enough, 2003 we had the original recall of Gray Davis that led to Arnold Schwarzenegger being elected. And Jim, you probably remember that very well, because it fell right in the middle of the mayoral election here in San Francisco, right?
We did. I think it was in October. Was it October, I believe, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, and it was actually interesting. It created this, kind of whole, interesting political dynamic in town, and it'll be. I know there's some people that have talked about on the board of supervisors and elsewhere of trying to put some other things on the ballot with the gubernatorial recall. I don't know if that'll be possible in terms of legislative timing and schedules and all of that sort of thing. But it kind of creates an interesting dynamic on who turns out. The electorate for a recall election's really interesting. It tends to be not like a primary or general, because you get kind of you get a little bit of the primary voters that are kind of typical primary. You get some of the general voters that are always voting the general. It's an interesting mix that you get turnout there, and there'll be a lot of groups, I think, that will be trying to push turnout, for Governor Newsom, looking into November. But yeah, the 2003 Gray Davis, but not to get too much into the gubernatorial one, but Gray Davis, and there's some folks here probably remember this better than I, because I was a little distracted with the Newsom campaign at the time. He was extraordinarily unpopular. I mean, California had gone through this period of rolling blackouts. The economy wasn't great. He was really weak in dealing with the energy companies. His campaign that had happened just a couple years before that was not a terribly inspiring campaign. He had spent a bunch of money attacking Richard Riordan, the former mayor of LA, in the primary to try to set the field so he would run against a more conservative Republican rather than Riordan, who was a pretty moderate Republican. So it was a really uninspiring campaign when he ran the first time. And like I said, his numbers were terrible. And then his campaign against the recall wasn't all that great either, right? It wasn't necessarily a campaign you would want to put your name on.
I seem to remember no on recall, yes on Bustamante being one of the most muddled messages that I had ever heard.
Yeah, well, and that was one of the other issues. I mean, that's one thing that the first thing you want to do, when you're running a recall or any campaign, is you want to coalesce your base, right? And that's the one thing that's very apparent right now to me. I mean, I don't know if never say never, but it doesn't look like a Democrat will get in the race to, oppose Newsom. That seems very, pretty clear. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. With that being the case, Newsom's very much going to coalesce that Democratic, base in California, which is, enough to win in and of itself. And that's the first thing you want to do. And Davis was unable to do that when he was running.
And I think so. You bring up something really interesting there, which is one of the big differences between local recalls and a gubernatorial recall is gubernatorial recalls, they run a special election that coincides with the recall itself. So you are picking a replacement as you're doing a recall. And here in San Francisco, that's different, right?
Yeah, it is a bit different. You get recalled, then they run an election. I don't know if you get recalled. I didn't look at this.
The mayor appoints a replacement.
Yeah, the mayor appoints. But can you run? Can you run for your seat? I don't know the answer to that. I did not look that up.
That I actually don't know. That is an interesting question.
because that, that would be so San Francisco, right? That's just like,
That would be classic to see someone
Yeah.
recalled and then run in a special election for their own seat.
yeah, that would be, well, I mean, that's the thing you learn in San Francisco politics is you don't lose until you quit, so that's that would be the lesson there. That would be the object lesson there.
Yeah. So it sounds like what's driving the the gubernatorial recall is sort of kind of it's a series of kind of strange events that led to an extension of the signatures, and it also being sort of a Republican Hail Mary in hopes of winning the Democratic, what has been a Democratic seat, a gubernatorial seat for quite some time. Is that right?
It is, and the other thing, just and it, not to discount on all of this is, especially the gubernatorial, is there's a few people that are trying to make a career, make a living, make money, kind of add some luster to what were pretty lackluster resumes before this all happened. I mean, 3 guys from Reading are the ones who led the charge for the recall that the Republicans would really like to keep, under wraps, because they're, basically insurrectionists. I don't think any of them were at the Capitol on January 6th, but that may have just been because they couldn't get tickets in a hotel room. But they're basically guys that would be very happy to have been there. There was kind of 3 guys from Reading that have been profiled. One was kind of a disc jockey radio station host that got kicked off the air for saying things on the radio station that wasn't very was just beyond any bounds of reasonableness, and even for conservative radio. So and then I don't know if folks have followed what's going on up in kind of Reading in the far north of the state, but it's becoming very militantly pro-gun, very militantly kind of militia-ish. It's a little bit scary, for those of you who haven't been tracking it, a little bit out of like the a scene in a movie, but and that kind of drove a lot of it, and then COVID with the shutdowns and all of that, the disagreement, whether or not it was just a bad flu, a lot of that led to the governor's recall. But the issue, I think, or the result of that is, Governor Newsom, I think, will win the recall handily, and either in September or October, or November, whenever that happens, unless he makes some really significant mistakes continually between now and then. I don't know, gets a meal card at the French Laundry and goes to have lunch there every day, or something like that. I don't know what the equivalent would be to that, but unless he makes continual mistakes between now and then, and knowing Gavin Newsom, I actually think the recall helps him in a way, because it makes him focus. He's better when he's in a fight than when he's not in a fight, and I think in a way he's less likely to make a mistake or do something he shouldn't in the next 3 months, because he knows there's stakes. When things are easy and it's easy, you're winning and there's not a fight, he has a tendency to get a little bit lazy. So I think that he'll be fine. He'll win handily, and it'll have the added effect of making his election next year in 2022 pretty much a cakewalk. I don't think he'll have any real challenge, and he'll win in a pretty decisive way.
Yeah,
maybe Cox will run again and bring out the bear.
Well, I think what's interesting, you brought up the Feinstein recall, and as I was researching it, one of the little interesting things that I saw was the 1983 election was the only mayoral election, I believe, going back to the 60s, maybe even the 50s, that didn't have a runoff, back when we used to have runoffs. So she got over 50% in the first round after the recall in her election, which was really unheard of, and again, didn't happen again in the time that San Francisco did have runoffs for mayor.
Yeah, I mean, and it's actually interesting what drove the recall. It's really fascinating. So Dianne Feinstein signed a bill, the big gun issue of the 80s 70s, 80s were they're called Saturday night specials, was handguns. People would go into a gun store, buy a gun, walk out the door and shoot somebody. But they were handguns, not, today's gun issue is automatic weapons, so you can only shoot 6 people with the Saturday night special. But she put in place a gun control resolution, and the White Panthers pushed the recall and got the vote support for the recalls. This kind of combination of the White Panthers and then Dianne Feinstein actually vetoed legislation that would have extended domestic partners benefits to city workers who were LGBT or LGB, probably at that point. It was probably just LG, but it would have extended domestic partner benefits. And it was the combination of those two. So, and the White Panthers were an allied group with the Black Panthers, and they were worried that poor people wouldn't be able to get guns to protect themselves from the state, not from like other folks, but from like the police. So it was a really interesting, what drove that recall was just kind of a fascinating thing. I actually ended up, when you asked me to do this, I knew a little bit about it. But I asked, actually know quite a few people, a lot of people in politics really got, that I grew up with, people that were kind of ahead of me in politics, got their start in that race. So I called a few of them and chatted with them about what drove it, and then went and did some research as well. It's just fascinating how that segment of time happened and what drove her recall. That's totally irrelevant to this conversation, I think. Yeah,
it's really interesting, and the one precinct she lost was the precinct where the White Panthers were based out of all the precincts in the city. But let's get to the local stuff, because that's, I think, the things that everyone are the most excited about. So let's talk about this DA recall. So first, what is driving it? And second, why are there 2 different recall committees that have spun up and that are collecting signatures, and they're telling you not to sign each other's?
I'm gonna probably offend some folks. I'm just gonna say it though. I think the DA recall is a grift. I think the second one is, it's just a bunch of people saw an opportunity to, go make some money. I think look, I support Chesa or don't, the guy is doing what he said he would do when he ran. He's clearly not incompetent or corrupt. And then you look at it, and just the chances of either of these recalls actually succeeding, I think, are, slim to none, unless some billionaire decides they want to drop in, $1 million to take him out. And even then, I don't know if he would succeed. It'll probably take $1 million to get it on the ballot, and then another, 10 on that. So, I think that some folks, just, hey, I need to figure out a way to make a living. I'm not going to name any names, but I'll say, some people, hey, I need to find a way to make a living, and they're on the grift. It's a great way to create a client. Now they can raise money for it. They can tap into a little bit of anger, and they have a client. And it'll be interesting to watch the expenditure reports as much as it'll be interesting to watch the donations. People always kind of get focused on who's giving money, but where the money's going is going to be interesting on all these races as well. So yeah, I think it's just, I think it's a basically people are trying to recall Chesa in ways of keeping their career alive, or keeping getting a paycheck.
Well, speaking of money, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe one of the things with these recalls is recall committees can actually roll over the money that they raised into future committees about those races. So potentially these DA recalls could raise a lot of money and then roll them over into IEs that could then spend in the next DA race. Is that right?
Yeah, they're the pack structure allows that. So so they could do that. I don't know if that's necessarily a function of just it's a recall committee, just the way the because the campaign finance committee would be different than so the campaign finance law is separate from the recall law. They're two separate sections of not to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but they're two separate sections of the code. And but the recall committee, the nature of the committee that you open for a recall allows you to roll it into whatever you want.
Okay. And with these two different committees, it sounds like, at least from what I've read, they actually can't combine signatures. So it's both of them are collecting separately, but it will undermine both of them to be able to collect all the signatures they need to if they're both working, in parallel. Isn't that right?
Correct. I mean, that again, another reason why I think that this is just it's not serious. It's not a real effort. If it was a serious effort, one or the other would allow it to move forward. But I at this point, and they're fighting each other. What they're saying, don't sign the other's petition, which is creating more confusion and making it more likely that or less likely that something will qualify. At the end of the day, I think this is I mean, and one of them has real political operatives. Mary Jung has been around for a long time. She was president of the DCCC at one point. It does lobbyist for the realtors, has real political experience. And the folks around it. And you would think that they would see that, but that's what leads me to believe that these aren't truly serious efforts to recalling the DA, or they're serious, but they're not likely to be successful. Just because you don't see the discipline, you don't see the willingness to kind of give up or give something to reach your end goal that you would expect in a candidate or a campaign like this.
So it sounds like you don't think that the DA recalls are going to succeed in getting this on the ballot. Is that right?
Well, never. I mean, I always got to caveat it. I work in politics. I don't want to say it. I don't want to be that hard. But I never say never. But right now, looking at it, they got like 30 grand if you have 30 grand in the bank, you need to go buy, $1 million or $700,000, $800,000 worth of signatures. I've been in that situation before with signature drives, and that it's about time to, pay off your vendors and make sure nobody loses too much money. I mean, not with recalls, but with initiatives, we've done a lot of them over the years for ballot measures. It's kind of similar, analogous. But yeah, at this point, I wouldn't. I think it would be really tough. I mean, you got to take it seriously. Chesa the DA needs to take this seriously. You either run unopposed or run scared. You never want to take this lightly. But I think it's really a long shot.
Oh. And then let's finish off before we throw it to questions with the school board recall. So what's driving the school board recall of these candidates that are, I believe, all up in 2022?
Well, I mean, it's clearly the anger around. I mean, I think there's three things. There's real anger with how the school district, from a lot of folks, handled the, just handled the opening or not opening of schools and dealing with kids in schools around COVID. Then, on top of that, there were the concerns about the, renaming of a bunch of high schools or schools in general. And then I think the third piece that's really out there is, changing Lowell from being a school you test into to one that is open and accessible to more folks. I think those are the three main issues that were floating around there that kind of drove this. drives this. And you know, I think there's a little bit more heat behind there's a little bit more support behind the school district recall than the DA recall, is kind of my sense. You know, I don't think you can have a legitimate signature gathering operation in San Francisco. You can't say your signature gathering operation is legitimate until people start getting in fights on the street. You know, I mean, until one side starts calling the other one, because that's just an indication of how many people you have on the street, right? You know, you need X number of people on the street to get into Y number of, you know, encounters with people before you get a sum of, you know, a reported altercation, right? That there's like some sort of algorithm there. You know, so I do think there's some real support there. And, you know, there's a variety of issues, though, that I think the recall orders for the school board or recall organizers, people trying to recall the school board face. One of which is just so many few people in San Francisco have kids. You know, and it's hard to get people really fired up about the school board, you know, when they don't have kids. You know, there's a variety of other reasons. You know, their city, you know, they're very dispersed. It's hard to get traction citywide. A whole bunch of reasons, but you know, I would say if I think there's a. But the one thing I will say about the school board recalls, I don't think that is a grift. I think there's people that are legitimately upset and legitimately have concerns about the school board and the policies that they're putting forward, and whether or not they're legitimate or whether or not they have real concerns and real complaints about that, and should be taken seriously. And, you know, whether or not they'll qualify, I don't know on that one. There's some pockets of money, I think, for the school board that don't exist for the Boudin recall. You know, a lot of rich people, a lot of people who were rich went to Lowell, right? You know, and you know, is that a reason, or is there enough money to kind of generate that? So we'll see on that one. I think that one's a little bit tougher to read at this point for me. You know, there's people around that recall that are again, you know, real political operatives that you would think would be getting good advice and giving them good direction. So we'll see with the school board one, but even then they're up next year. So I think it's a real gamble to actually drive a recall this year. I think the only reason why, on the politics of it, why you would do it, from my take, is you're hoping if you put a recall threat out there on these school board members, it will hold them in check from doing anything until you can get to a regular election and potentially beat them.
Okay, so it sounds like that is the recall that you're the most unsure of which direction it would go, or even whether it'll qualify.
Yeah. No, I mean, people know who the DA is. I mean, you know, DA is a DA, right? They're big, you know. I don't know before this if anybody could have named, you know, more than 2 or 3 members, and even this group, which is a really political group, more than 2 or 3 members of the school board, you know.
I was going to say, I'm ashamed to say that I think before 2019, I could probably only name 3 members of the 7-member school board. And I feel like I follow politics locally pretty closely.
Yeah.
So with that, let's throw it to questions. What I'm going to ask is that if anybody does have a question, just use the raise hand feature so that we don't all come off mute and yell at the same time. But I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So I think we have one hand raised. It looks like it is Bobak. So Bobak, take it away. What's your question?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was doing folding laundry or listening to you, so it's a little messy in here. But I
was trying to see if any of those signs are any of mine. I couldn't tell.
Oh, probably, maybe. I don't know. I put up a lot of signs on my wall there. My main question is, you brought up a number of examples, but I thought the 2 that were most interesting are one you didn't bring up, which was the. By the way, apologies. I live in D1, so I'm right on. I'm a neighbor to the D2 Democratic Club, but not in it proper. But there was a lot of grumbling literally after DA Boudin won his election, where my Supervisor Sandra Fewer, famously said, "Fuck the POA," and that got a bunch of my neighbors really cranky. They thought that it was weird and disrespectful and blah 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 blah. And a bunch of them started the process of opening a committee to do a recall. And I remember one of my neighbors at the time asked me for like my opinion on this, and I said it was dumb and that they shouldn't do it because it's extraordinarily difficult. And she was going to be up for re-election in the following year anyway. That ended up happening. She ended up deciding not run. But Sandy's one example. And then the other example that I'm thinking of is actually, you brought it up, the mayor of, I forget the town, Windsor, where like really heinous accusations have come out. And even if they're not proven to be valid, even though I believe the accusations are valid, it seemed like for a while there, that guy was digging in his heels and was adamant he wasn't going anywhere. I raise these to basically ask the question of like, is there a way that we could potentially figure out a better standard than what we have today, which is if you don't like the person's haircut, you can try to recall them? Because it feels to me like the stuff we're griping about the supervisor swearing once seems silly, but the Windsor one, and in my opinion, I'm not on board with all of the Board of Education recalls, but I think the one against Alison Collins has extraordinary merit. Like some people believe that there's this threshold, but as you put it, there is no actual threshold in the law. I'm wondering if anybody's attempted to define a threshold or attempted to like make that more apparent in any more definable way.
I've not heard anybody trying to, kind of alter this, I think it's a good conversation to start and to have, like I said, this is actually an interesting debate or discussion, about recalls, just the whole, discussion of it. I kind of like the fact that we have the power as citizens to hold our elected officials to account, right? But on the other hand, you don't want to have people who start to abuse the process, like the mayor, or like it's happening to the district attorney in Sonoma, where I think that there's real abuse of the system there. So there is that kind of conversation of that I think would be very useful to have. Of, is there a standard that you should put in place, or is there something of that sort of thing? But I'm a Democrat, big D, but I'm also a little D Democrat. I like giving people a chance to vote on things. I mean, I just kind of my take on it, and also it's good for business for me, when you let people vote on things. But that said, I mean, it is. I mean, just think about it. We get to hold our elected officials to account, whether they're progressive. I mean, Ed Lee was attempted to be recalled, as well. And that came from, he was much more moderate than folks liked, and more from the progressive side. So, it kind of has happened both ways, cut both ways in San Francisco. But, I do like this, idea of holding elected officials to account, but I do think we should have a conversation, or let's have a discussion on, is there a standard that you have to put together before you, go through all this? Because they're expensive, right? We're going to end up spending probably in San Francisco $500,000 on recall. Even, if one pops up, and even if we don't, it'll probably take, a couple $100,000 of your money, taxpayer money, which I know in San Francisco people don't think is a lot of money, but it's a lot of money.
Yeah. Zoe, I think you are next. So go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, I am in District 1, but I'm actually been here 13 years from New Jersey, and I have this recalls. I can't imagine anything being more undemocratic. Basically, like when I saw how much it costs, you're paying people to get signatures for these recalls, where we do can hold our politicians accountable by our protests. The idea that, criminal activity, yes, then they are charged with a crime, but I'm appalled that we have these recalls and the money that's being spent to by these special elections. It's just outrageous to be called a democratic city or a state, that we play these games, and it's a game because it's so much money that's coming in. 800,000 from this guy, the developer.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard one thing tonight that would say that recalls are justified whatsoever. I'd like to see them taken off. I'm not sure the next.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues, one of the reasons why I think the recall is there is you can actually, until you're convicted of a crime, you're presumed innocent, right? So, being charged with the crime, and we've had a few cases in California, more than a few actually, where politicians have been charged with, felonies and abuse of the public trust. And if it wasn't for the recall system, they wouldn't have been there. But I do think there's a conversation to be had, and I think that there's, the abuse of that system, especially in Sonoma, which I think is just, and it's just amazing what they've done there and how they've abused the system. I think there's a real conversation to be had on, is there a way to create a threshold or a better threshold for moving a recall forward? Maybe it's, you have to file like you have to give a statement of reasons why you're recalling a petition, but maybe it's, they have to have a hearing in front of the Board of Supervisors before you can go forward with it. Or I don't know, maybe there's a thing you could do. I don't know what it is. I don't have the solution for that.
But New Jersey is known for its corrupt politicians. Sorry, and
I know.
Pretty easily.
We've done New Jersey politics.
I mean, it was a challenge to get rid of a one Chris Christie. But so Jim, this brings something else up. And Babak got me thinking about this. Something I heard a lot, I think back in 2019, because I remember the first time that I heard about a Chesa recall was literally days after it was confirmed that he had won that election. But something that I heard come up quite a bit is that there might be a little bit more salience if these things were to make the ballot for both or for really almost any position in San Francisco now, because school board to be elected, you don't actually have to get 50% of the vote, right? I mean, you can win with, I think in some cases we've had as little as 15% of the vote someone has won with. And with ranked choice voting, once a lot of the ballots have spoiled or have expired, you can end up with someone having never actually had 50% of all the ballots cast. So do you think that actually makes a recall more likely to succeed if it does make the ballot, because they've never actually had a full 50% support?
I mean, there's if it qualifies, right? There's that caveat, because I think a lot of the qualifications is that. And it really depends, I think, on the race at that point. I think it really depends on the actual race. Like for Chesa, right? And Dale points out correctly that we don't have ranked choice voting in school board races, but they are. I think because they're multi-candidate races, they're always kind of a little bit challenging or a little bit difficult. Right. There's always a pocket.
Hence why somebody can win with 15%.
But somebody was making it. I can't remember the percentage, but somebody made the argument, or was making the statement about Chesa that he only won quote unquote with 30% of the vote or 35% of the vote because of ranked choice voting. And that's the system we have, is ranked choice voting, right? So he won with 50%. He won. Well, and Eric, it's kind of to my point that I was making about how recall elections tend to, if they don't succeed, they tend to make the candidate running stronger. And you have a real opportunity for Chesa right now. And I've talked to, he didn't get the Democratic Central Committee when he ran for DA. If he gets recalled, he'll get the Democratic Central Committee will endorse his campaign. Him not being recalled. It already has, right? That's a great example. It gives an opportunity for these candidates to really broaden their base of support. And I think to a degree that they might not have enjoyed before. And then the next time they're up, they can move to be reelected.
So it sounds like the lesson is in, as you said at the beginning, which I was thinking was a wire reference, but I'm now in the back of my mind thinking that maybe this is actually a saying in general, which is, if you go after the king, you best not miss.
I want to say it's a very that's a alliteration or change. I think that actually was used in Shakespeare, and it wasn't it was it was in pentameter, but I do think the original quote is like so much in our language from Shakespeare. But yeah.
Okay. Well, do we have any other questions? I think Mike had a question in the chat about the Aaron Persky recall, which we didn't bring up. That was that judge down in Santa Clara County that gave a particularly lenient sentence to someone.
Yeah, we didn't bring that up, but I mean, that's well, there's a whole argument there that around judicial appointments and how they're selected and having judicial elections, that we could talk about. That's having done some judicial campaigns in my career, judges hate to run for office, but then how do you pick them and how do you make sure of all that? But the Persky thing was interesting. So there's a debate, for those who don't know, there was a swimmer at Stanford, a former swimmer, not to taint swimmers with that, but who raped a woman or sexually assaulted a woman while both of them were drunk, and the judge in the case gave the young man a very, some would say obscenely, and I wouldn't disagree with it, light sentence for that attack, and faced a recall. And I think probably that's a case where you could have probably waited. I don't know what his term was, is always the issue. I mean, that's always the question. It's like, I think the thing with the recall is, do you need somebody out of office or out of that position of authority as soon as possible, right? Or can you wait until they're up for their normal election? And I think that was the case where the backers of that recall felt like the rulings that this judge was making raised to that level that they needed him, that they felt he needed to be out of office immediately.
I think in the case of Aaron Persky, it was actually, he was up for re-election the year that decision came down, and he was running unopposed.
Right.
And you're unable to have a write-in candidate for local judicial election in particular. And so they then had to do the waiting of 6 months post him being reelected for them to be able to collect the signatures and recall him. So I think they were facing at least another 4 years of him being a judge.
Yeah. And that's where having a tool. I mean, I do think you need a tool to kind of hold folks accountable. I just think that there's, in a democracy, there's always a tendency, or there's always oftentimes the ability to abuse that tool.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, do we have any other questions? Anyone else raise their hand? Suki, go ahead. Suki's one of our board members.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to say that I think and this doesn't apply to anybody here, but I think if people paid more attention to what they're voting for and voting on, they wouldn't need a do-over after the election.
That's not
going to happen. Yeah, I mean,
hence maybe the Democratic clubs like us can, do what we can to disseminate information and increase involvement and registration.
I mean, I do think that actually it's remarkable. I mean, having done politics in San Francisco, in and around other places, and in other places, is the level of informed voter in San Francisco compared to just about any place else I've I've worked is extraordinary. You know, just the fact that it's, you know, a random Monday in June, you know, in a non-election year, and there's what, 30 people on this, 20 people on this, you know, Zoom call, is a testament to, I don't know, I can think of off the top of my head, you know, a dozen other places where we could do this. So you know, I do agree with you that more people need to pay attention, but I do think in San Francisco we have a pretty high level of that, which is why you always say it's only in San Francisco. But I do think that, you know, we could discuss why that is. You know, I miss, and Eric brought up, I don't necessarily dislike ranked choice voting, but I do think that runoff elections created a bit more sharper contrast between candidates, you know, and allowed for a lot of stuff to kind of come out. So it'd be interesting if you could somehow or another combine or come up with a system that created that contrast a little bit better, that really got people to focus.
Yeah, I think, and Suki makes an interesting point here in the chat, which is San Francisco, despite having very high turnout in midterms, primaries, and general elections, historically has actually had quite low turnout during the off-year elections that we have for mayor, DA, city attorney, things like that. In fact, I believe aside from the 2018 special election for mayor, the last time we had broken 50% in a mayoral race was that runoff in 2003.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that, you know, you create that stark choice between Gavin Newsom and Matt Gonzalez, you're going to get a 50, doing this off the top 55. Of my head, but it was 50. Yeah, I thought I was going to say 56, but yeah, 55% turnout election, right? You know, and I don't know if anybody was here in 2003. I mean, the town was kind of buzzing with that race, right? It was an exciting thing. People got involved and people got into it. And that's how mayoral elections were in San Francisco, you know, going back, you know, and I don't want to blame it on ranked choice voting, because I don't think it's all of that, but I do think that, you know, so media attention, you know, the reporters, the newspapers, the TV, the kind of the campaigns, all those things drive turnout. You know, the mechanics of turnout, GOTV, is only a piece of that. It can only move the electorate, you know, 5 or 6 points. It's really the broader, you know, just there's a big campaign going on in town is what really drives turnout. And, you know, since 2003, we haven't had a real big mayoral race. You know, the mayoral races have been, you know, Ed Lee was kind of big, but it wasn't that much. I mean, remember that the mayoral race, you know, for Gavin Newsom, I mean, we raised $6.5 million, $7 million for that race in $500 increments. You know, Matt Gonzalez raised a couple $1 million, you know, all the other candidates raised a bunch. So that was a big race. And that's what drives turnout, the big races. It's exciting. People pay attention, you know, and it gets them focused.
Yeah, well, and that's back when $6 million was real money. Yeah. Well, if there are any other questions, please raise your hand or take yourself off of mute and speak now or forever hold your peace. I'll give everybody 10 seconds to do it. Otherwise, Jim, thank you. This has been great. This is really informative. And I think this is, in my opinion, one of the best uses of a Democratic club, especially in the off years, is actually trying to do our best to inform the voters about what it is they'll be voting on, what they're thinking, and what's going on in the city. So again, I really, really appreciate it. And if there are no questions, I don't think I see any hands. I filibustered long enough to hopefully give people time. Then I will bid you all good night. All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Oh.